The distress beacon came from a grain hauler, not a warship, not a military relay. A grain hauler named the CSD Plenty, drifting at the edge of the Calder Passage with a busted thruster coil and 40,000 tons of wheat in its belly, trying to reach a colony of 300,000 people who were 6 weeks from running out of food. That was what started it. The Voreth patrol ship detected the beacon first. Under Galactic Accord law, a vessel in distress in contested space was considered Accord property until a claim was filed. The Voreth filed the claim in 9 minutes. They were fast like that. By the time the Plenty's captain, a tired woman named Rose, understood what was happening, there were 2 Voreth frigates flanking her and a third vessel broadcasting seizure codes at her hull computers. Rose sent one message to Confederate Space Command. It said, "They are taking my ship, please hurry." Then she sat down, poured herself a cup of cold coffee, and waited. 3 days later, the Calder Passage had a different kind of traffic. The Voreth had called in their allies. The Palans sent 11 ships, long and segmented like the insects their bodies resembled. The Gretz sent 4, slow-moving slabs of gray rock that barely registered on visual sensors but hit like small moons on every other kind. The Voreth themselves had 22 frigates and a command vessel, a sleek needle of a ship called the Vel Sarin, carrying Grand Marshal Rael Sova, the man who had personally drafted the Accord's new expansion restriction policy. 37 ships total, all pointed at one grain hauler. It was, by any measure, excessive. That was the point. Rael Sova broadcast a system-wide declaration. The CSD Plenty had entered contested space without a filed transit permit. It was now under Accord custodial hold. Any Confederate vessel attempting to interfere would be considered an act of aggression under 12 different Accord treaties, all of which he named slowly, by number. Then he waited too. Inside the Plenty, Rose and her crew of 9 ate their meals, ran card games, fixed the thruster coil themselves with parts from the engine room floor, and listened to the alien ships hold their formation outside. One of the engineers, a young man named Dev, kept running calculations on how long their food and air would last. He stopped sharing the results after the 3rd day. On the 5th day, something arrived at the edge of long-range sensors. One ship. The Voreth tactical officer on the Vel Sarin ran the first scan and read the results twice. Then she ran it again. Then she walked to Grand Marshal Sova's station and stood there without speaking until he looked up at her. She handed him the data pad. He read it. He set it down very carefully on his console, which was made of polished stone imported from the Voreth homeworld and had survived 2 previous commands. Then he picked the pad back up and read it again. The ship was called the CNS Iron Meridian. Its classification in Confederate records was listed as Siege-class Dreadnought, which was a category that had not existed in any Accord intelligence file 18 months ago, because 18 months ago it had not existed anywhere. It had been built in the Croft Yards over a period of 4 years behind a security classification that the Accord's best intelligence network had rated as unlikely to contain anything significant. They had been wrong. The Iron Meridian was 4.1 kilometers long. That number did not mean much on its own until you understood that the largest Voreth warship ever built was 900 meters and had taken 20 years to construct and was considered the pride of the entire Voreth naval tradition. The Meridian was not sleek. It was not elegant. It did not look like something that was trying to impress anyone. It looked like someone had decided to weld a city to a weapons platform and then kept adding weapons until they ran out of room, and then added more room. Its hull was the color of burnt iron, uneven, layered in reactive plating that had been tested in live combat. Not test combat, not simulated scenarios, real battles in humanity's own wars against other humans, which was a fact that the Palan representative spent several minutes quietly processing before she could continue her work. The Meridian dropped out of its fold jump at a distance of 40,000 kilometers from the Accord fleet and stopped. It did not broadcast a greeting. It did not make demands. It sent one short message, addressed specifically to the CSD Plenty. The message said, "We are here, Rose. Take your time." On the Plenty, Rose read the message and started laughing. Dev, who had been checking the air supply calculations again, looked up and asked what was funny. She turned her screen toward him. He looked at the sensor image of the meridian for a long time. Then he closed his calculation sheet, put away his data pad, and started making dinner. On the Vel Sarin, no one was making dinner. Grand Marshal Rail Sova stood at the forward viewport and looked at the shape hanging in the dark between his fleet and the freighter, and felt something he had not felt in 30 years of military service. It was not fear exactly. It was the specific feeling of standing at the edge of something and understanding, in your body before your mind caught up, that the edge was much closer than you had thought. He called a senior staff meeting. His officers arrived quickly. They sat down. They all had the same expression. Nobody spoke first for almost a full minute. The Accord fleet did not sleep. Not literally, because 2 of the 3 species present did not sleep the way humans did. But the night cycle passed, and every ship in the formation held its position, and every sensor array stayed pointed at the iron meridian. And the data kept coming back the same way it had the first time, which was the problem. Numbers did not lie. The Meridian's reactor output alone was putting off more energy than the entire Accord formation combined. Its point defense grid, which was the system designed to shoot down incoming missiles and small ships, consisted of 340 independently operated rail cannons, each capable of cycling 12 rounds per second. The Palin fleet commander, a small multi-limbed creature named Bress, had her tactical staff run the engagement math 4 times. The results were consistent. In a direct assault scenario, the Accord fleet could destroy the Meridian, but it would take between 60 and 80% of their total force to do it, and that estimate assumed the Meridian's crew did not perform well under pressure, which felt like a bad assumption given everything else. Bress sent her numbers to Grand Marshal Sova. He did not reply for 2 hours. What Sova was actually doing during those 2 hours was standing alone in the Vel Sarin's rear observation bay, staring at the stars, trying to understand how he had ended up here. He had built his career on the expansion restriction policy. He had argued in front of the full Accord Council that humanity was a young species, an aggressive species, a species that needed to be contained before it destabilized 3 centuries of carefully managed galactic order. He had been persuasive. He had been right, he still believed. The problem was that no one had told the humans. The Iron Meridian sat out there in the dark and did nothing. That was what bothered him most. A threatening fleet moved. A threatening fleet postured and cycled weapons and ran aggressive formation drills. The Meridian just sat there. Its lights were on. Its systems were running. Somewhere inside it, 3,000 human crew members were doing whatever human crew members did, and the ship itself seemed about as concerned with the 37 Accord vessels surrounding it as a mountain is concerned with weather. On the second morning, the Meridian's captain opened a channel. His name was Aldrich Knorr. He appeared on screen as a lean man in a gray uniform with no decorations on it except a small Confederate flag patch on one shoulder. He looked like someone who had spent a long time in space and had stopped being surprised by most things. He did not announce himself with a title. He said, "Grand Marshal, I understand you have a freighter in custody. I would like to discuss that." Sova composed himself and accepted the channel. He was good at this. 30 years of command had given him a voice like polished stone. He said, "The CSD Plenty entered contested space without a valid transit permit. This is an Accord enforcement matter. Your presence here is irregular." Knorr nodded. He seemed to find this reasonable. He said, "I can see that. But the permit system was updated 6 weeks ago, and the Plenty filed under the old format, which was still listed as valid on the Confederate Commerce Registry. There seems to be a gap in how the change was communicated." He paused. "These things happen. I thought we could sort it out without anyone getting hurt." Sova did not say anything for a moment. He was looking at Knorr's face, trying to find the threat in it. It was not there. The man looked like he was discussing a scheduling problem. That was when the Gret observer, Sewell, who had been silent on the combined command channel for 12 hours, spoke for the first time. Sewell's voice was slow and dry like wind over stone. It said, "Captain Noor, what class of vessel are you commanding?" Noor glanced to the side of his screen, which was probably where his crew were sitting. He looked back. He said, "Siege class, first of the line. We finished her about 14 months ago." "How many more are there?" "I am not able to share production details." Noor said it pleasantly, like he was declining a second helping of food. There was a pause, then Sewell said, still in that slow, dry voice, "That is an answer." Bress, listening on the command channel, understood what Sewell meant immediately. The answer to how many more are there was not 0. It was not 1. If it were a small number, Noor would have said a small number, because a small number is not a threat, it is a reassurance. The fact that he declined to answer meant the answer was large enough to matter. She ran the engagement numbers a 5th time. Then she closed the file. On the Plenty, Rose had fixed the thruster coil. Her ship was fully operational. She had not tried to leave because no one had told her to, and because she was not, as she described herself, an idiot. She was watching the meridian on her navigation screen and eating a sandwich, and she was thinking about the colony waiting for her wheat, and she was thinking about the 300,000 people there, and she was thinking that she had sent one message, and this was what had arrived, and she was thinking that whatever people said about the Confederacy, whatever arguments they made about politics and treaties and expansion, when you sent one message and said, "Please hurry," and this was what came. There was something to be said for that. Dev came in and asked if she wanted more coffee. She said yes. The idea came from a young Voreth officer named Seth, who was 26 years old and had graduated top of his class at the Voreth Naval Institute and had never been in a real engagement, which was precisely the kind of background that produces ideas like the one he had. He brought it to his senior commander, a worn and careful woman named Admiral Dara Halston, who ran the Voreth Tactical Division on the Velsorin. He said, "We probed them. A close pass. 6 fast ships, tight formation, inside their point defense envelope. If they fire, we have an act of aggression on record, and the Accord Council authorizes a full response. If they don't fire, we establish that they are bluffing and the fleet gains confidence." Halston looked at him for a long time. She asked, "What if they are not bluffing?" Seth said, "Then we lose 6 ships, but we know." She thought about this. She thought about it longer than Seth expected. Then she took it to Sova, because she was not authorized to approve something like this, and she wanted it on his record and not hers. Sova approved it. 6 Voreth fast attack ships peeled out of formation just after the 3rd shift change. They were the fastest vessels in the fleet, built for exactly this kind of operation: close approach, sensor sweep, extraction. Their pilots were good. Halston had picked them herself, which was the last useful thing she did before sitting down and watching the sensor feed with her hands flat on her knees. The Meridian watched them come. That was the first strange thing. Every system on a ship that size was always running, always generating data, but there was a particular quality to the way a warship's sensors focused on you, a sharpening that experienced pilots could feel through their instruments. The Voreth pilots felt it from 40,000 kilometers out. By 20,000, one of them reported on the closed channel that his proximity alerts were going off even though he was nowhere near actual proximity. His instruments were telling him he was close to something enormous. He was. He just wasn't close enough yet for it to make physical sense. By 10,000 kilometers, the Meridian's profile filled their forward displays completely. That was when the second strange thing happened. Nothing. No weapon locks, no warning broadcasts, no defensive maneuvers. The Meridian sat exactly as it had been sitting for 2 days, lights on, systems running as the 6 Voreth ships burned toward it at attack speed. The pilots swept through their pass, recorded every sensor reading they could pull, and came back out the other side. That should have felt like a victory. It did not feel like a victory. The debrief happened 30 minutes later. Halston ran it herself. She asked the lead pilot, a veteran named Aura, to describe the experience. Aura sat for a moment before answering. Then she said, "They knew we were there. Every system on that ship was tracking us. I have flown past Accord-heavy cruisers on live exercises, and you can feel when they are about to fire. There is something in the instrument response, a tightening. This was different. They were tracking us the way you track something that is not a threat. Halston said, not a threat because they could not stop you. Ora said, not a threat because they had decided it did not matter whether they stopped us or not. That sentence sat in the debrief room for a while. On the Meridian, the pass had barely registered as an event. The crew had watched the 6 Vorath ships on their screens, made notes in their logs, and continued normal operations. A gunner named Pell had placed a bet with his section chief about whether the probe ships would get within 5,000 kilometers. He had guessed no. He won. Captain Noor had not left his command chair during the approach. He had watched the sensor feed, confirmed that the Vorath ships were doing exactly what they appeared to be doing, and told his weapons officer to hold everything passive. When the 6 ships pulled away, he made one entry in his command log. It said, "Probe run completed. No engagement. Accord fleet appears to be assessing rather than committing. Recommend continued patience." Then he asked his comms officer if there had been any update from the CSD Plenty. There had. Rose had sent a message that said the thruster coil was running clean, and she was ready to move whenever someone told her it was safe. She had also sent, attached to the message, a photograph of the sandwich she had eaten, which she described as the best sandwich she had made in 3 months and proof that things were looking up. Noor showed it to his executive officer, a large, quiet woman named Beale, who studied the photograph seriously and then said it looked like good bread. On the Vel Sarin, Seth was being very quiet. His probe had returned data. The data showed the Meridian's internal power distribution during the approach, and what it showed was that at no point had the Meridian's weapon systems shifted from standby to active. They had tracked the probe ships on passive sensors the whole time, which meant that the decision not to fire had not been a close call. It had not been a warning held back by a careful hand. It had been complete indifference. Seth had wanted to find a bluff. There was no bluff. There was something worse than a bluff. There was a ship that did not need to threaten, because it had already calculated the outcome and found it satisfactory. He went back to his station and did not suggest anything else for the rest of the day. The Joint Council was held on a secure channel because no one wanted to be in the same physical space for this conversation. The Palin ships were arranged differently from the Vorath ships, and the Gret vessels ran at a different atmospheric mix. And the truth was that the 3 species of the Accord did not particularly like each other, had simply found it useful to agree on things. And right now, they were finding it useful to agree on what to do about the very large problem sitting 40,000 kilometers away. Bress spoke first, because the Palin were systematic and believed in beginning with facts. She put the engagement data on the shared screen. She walked through it without editorializing. She said, "At full engagement with optimal coordination, we destroy the Iron Meridian at a cost of between 60 and 80% of combined fleet strength. Those losses render all 3 of our navies non-functional for a minimum of 3 to 5 years. During that period, Confederate expansion continues unchecked." She paused. Then she said, "I want to be clear that this is the victory scenario." Sova said, "We are not here to fight them. We are here to enforce the transit restriction." Bress looked at him. She said, "Grand Marshal, the transit restriction is already over. The moment that ship arrived, the restriction became theoretical. What we are doing now is deciding how to acknowledge that without losing so much face that our home governments fall." That was a brutally honest thing to say, and the channel was quiet for a moment after she said it. The Gret observer Sewell spoke next. Sewell did not use a visual feed. Sewell communicated in audio only, a slow, careful voice that never seemed to be in a hurry, which was appropriate for a species that measured its history in thousands of years rather than hundreds. Sewell said, "I would like to tell you about the Duron." No one said they did not want to hear about the Duron. Sewell said, 4,100 years ago in the early period of the Second Accord, there was a species called the Duron. They were biological like humans. They were small like humans. They had large numbers and fast breeding cycles, and a tendency to expand into new space quickly and with minimal concern for existing territorial claims. They also had a quality that we labeled in the records of that era as unreasonable commitment. They did not retreat from engagements the way other species did when the cost became high. They continued, past the point of logic, past the point where any reasonable calculation said to stop. Sewell paused. The Accord of that era encountered the Duron when their expansion reached the Reth corridor. The Accord had more ships, better ships, more experience. The Accord initiated an interdiction. The Duron did not accept the interdiction. The war lasted 31 years. The Duron were eventually contained, but the cost was such that the Accord of that era effectively collapsed. The current Accord is built on the ruins of that one. Sova said, "You are saying humanity is the Duron." Sewell said, "I am saying humanity is what the Duron would have become if the Duron had had 400 more years to develop before the Accord noticed them. The Duron never built a ship like the Meridian. They never had the time. Humanity has had the time." The channel was very quiet. Then Bress said, "The permit issue is real. The Confederacy can file a legitimate grievance about the notification gap in the transit update. That gives us a procedural path. We conducted a custodial hold based on a valid reading of current law. The law had an acknowledged communication failure. The matter is resolved through normal diplomatic channels. No one backs down. Everyone finds a process." Sova understood what she was doing. She was building him an exit that did not look like an exit. He was grateful for it and also deeply tired, because he had come here believing he was enforcing reasonable policy, and what he had found instead was that the universe had changed while he was writing the policy, and no one had told him. What no one on the council said, because it did not need to be said, was the other thing in all of their minds. The Meridian was one ship. One. The Confederate production yards were large and had been running for 4 years behind a security classification that Accord intelligence had dismissed. Nor had declined to say how many siege-class vessels existed. That was its own answer. Sova made his decision alone, after the council call ended. He sat in his command chair and looked at the iron meridian on his forward screen, and he thought about the Duron, a species that no longer existed, and the Accord that had broken itself stopping them, and a grain hauler full of wheat heading to 300,000 hungry people. And he thought about how none of that was supposed to matter to him, because he was a Grand Marshal of the Voreth Navy enforcing a clear legal framework. Then he thought about what Bress had said, the victory scenario. He called Bress back. He said, "Walk me through the procedural path." She did. It took 40 minutes. When they were done, the path was clear enough. Not elegant, not satisfying, but clear. He called Captain Knorr. He said, "We appear to have identified an error in the transit notification process." He said it the way someone says something when they have decided to say it and are not going to say anything else. Knorr said, "I appreciate you looking into it." Sova said, "The CSD Plenty will be released pending a filing review, standard process." Knorr said, "That sounds right." There was a pause. Sova almost said something else. He decided not to. He ended the channel. The order releasing the CSD Plenty went out at 3:40 ship time on the Vel Sarin, when most of the crew were in rest cycle and the bridge was running on a skeleton watch. Sova had done it then on purpose. There was no audience. There was no ceremony. The release code was transmitted. The Voreth frigates flanking the Plenty acknowledged and began to move off. And the whole process looked, to anyone watching the logs afterward, like routine administrative processing rather than the end of a 6-day standoff with the most powerful warship in known space. Sova was good at this. He had been doing politics longer than he had been doing war. Rose on the Plenty was asleep when the release came through. Her night watch officer, a methodical man named Cart, received the code, verified it 3 times because he was that kind of person, and then went to wake her up. She came to the bridge in her socks, read the code herself, verified it herself, and then stood at the helm for a moment just breathing. Cart asked if they should get moving. Rose said, "Give me 1 minute." She spent the minute looking out the forward viewport at the Accord fleet still arrayed around them. 37 ships, the most firepower she had ever been this close to in her life. Then she looked at the Meridian, which was still sitting where it had been sitting, dark and enormous and very still. She sent one message to the Meridian. It said, "Heading out, thank you." The reply came back in under a minute. It said, "Safe run, Rose. Good luck with the delivery." She set the course herself. The Plenty's engines, freshly repaired, came up clean and smooth, and the grain hauler moved out of the Accord formation at standard commercial speed, not hurrying, not running, just going where it had always been going. No one stopped it. The Voreth frigates that had flanked it for 6 days watched it pass and did nothing. On the Meridian, Nor watched the Plenty clear the Accord formation and settle into its transit heading, and he felt something in his chest that was not quite relief but was adjacent to it. He had not been certain Sova would take the exit. Some people did not take exits. Some people decided the face cost was too high and chose the alternative, which in this case would have been catastrophic, and he had sat for 6 days with that possibility somewhere in the back of his mind, without allowing it to affect his conduct, because conduct was the thing that made the math work. If he had been tense, Sova would have seen tension, and tension told an opponent they were having an effect, and an opponent who knows they are having an effect becomes harder to offer exits to. So he had been patient. His crew had been patient. It was the thing they had trained for, in the cold and specific way that you trained for a thing you hoped never to use but knew you might. His executive officer Beale came to stand beside him. She said, "She's clear." He said, "Good." They watched the Plenty's drive signature get smaller on the screen. Around them, the Accord fleet was slowly, quietly beginning to shift formation, the way a crowd breaks up when the event is over, no single moment of decision, just a gradual collective movement toward somewhere else. The Gret ships went first. They had always been the most efficient. Then the Palin ships, peeling off in their segmented way, their formations dissolving and reforming in new configurations as they set headings for their own space. The Voreth fleet was last. The Vel Sarin held its position the longest. On the bridge, Sova watched the Plenty's drive trail until it was just a point of light among other points of light, and then he gave the order to come about and head home. His political situation would be complicated. The faction that had pushed him into this confrontation hopping for a clean outcome, either a Confederate defeat to use as propaganda or a Confederate aggression to use as justification, had gotten neither. They had gotten a procedural resolution and a Voreth fleet that had spent 6 days starring at the Iron Meridian and then left. There would be hearings. There would be questions about why he had backed down. He had already decided what he was going to say, which was the truth. He had not backed down because there had been nothing to back down from, because at no point had the Meridian done anything other than be present. That was the whole story. A ship had been present, and 37 Accord vessels had decided that their orders did not require them to die. He thought that was a reasonable thing to decide. He thought if he were honest with himself, that he would write his actual assessment in a private document and file it somewhere that the faction could not easily reach it, and the assessment would say that he had observed humanity in a crisis and found them to be patient, precise, and completely serious. The Meridian had never threatened anyone. It had never fired. It had never raised its voice. That was what would keep him awake at night for the next several years. Not the ship's size, not its weapons, the patience, the absolute, practiced, professional patience. On the Plenty, Rose plotted the final leg to the colony. 12 days out, 40,000 tons of wheat, 300,000 people eating again at the end of it. Dev brought her coffee. She drank it while it was still hot, which was something she had not been able to do in 6 days, and it tasted exactly like it always did, which was better than she remembered. The stars outside were the same stars they had always been. They looked different anyway. The colony was called Heron's Point. It had been settled 11 years ago by families who had come out from 3 different Earth nations and 2 orbital stations, people who had decided, for 100 different private reasons, that they wanted to be somewhere new. It had a main settlement of low prefab buildings, A grid of fields that were green in the right season and bare in the wrong one. A school with 2 teachers, a medical bay with 1 doctor, and a landing pad that had seen better years. When the plenty broke atmosphere and came down, there were people standing on the pad waiting. Not because they had been told to. Because they had been counting the days and they knew what the ship was carrying, and some things you just went to watch. Rose set the plenty down clean and walked down the ramp into air that smelled like cold soil and something burning in someone's stove nearby. The colony administrator, an older man named Gil, was at the bottom of the ramp. He shook her hand and said, "You're 11 days late." She said there was a complication. He said, "We heard. There was a bulletin from the Confederacy, something about a permit dispute." He paused. Seemed like a strange amount of firepower for a permit dispute. She looked at him. She thought about the 6 days, the Accord fleet, the Iron Meridian hanging in the dark. She thought about Noor's voice on the channel, easy and calm, the way someone sounds when they have done the math and are not worried about the answer. She said it got sorted out. Gil nodded. He had been on frontier worlds long enough to know when someone was leaving a lot out and to respect it. He said, "The kids are going to be glad to see that wheat." She said that's what it's there for. The unloading took most of the day. The colonists helped because that was how things worked out here. Dev ran the cargo manifest and crossed things off with the focused satisfaction of someone watching a problem disappear line by line. By evening, the plenty was empty, and the colony's storage was full, and the tables in the common hall were set for a meal that was going to be better than anything they had eaten in the past 2 weeks. Rose ate with them. She sat between Gil and a farmer named Wren who had come to Heron's Point from a city and was clearly still getting used to the quiet. Wren asked her about the trip. She gave the short version. Wren said, "Just one ship and they let you through." Rose thought about how to answer that. She said, it was a particular kind of ship. Across known space, the ripples were already moving. On the Gret homeworld, which had no name in any language other than the Gret's own and which was very old, Sewell filed his report. It was longer than most of his reports, and he had been writing reports for 900 years. The section that the Accord Council would remember was near the end. It said, "Humanity does not understand that it frightens us. This is not because they are unobservant. It is because they do not think of themselves as frightening. They think of themselves as people trying to get somewhere with a ship full of wheat. The ship they send to make sure the wheat arrives is the most dangerous vessel we have ever seen, and they named it after a geological feature, and staffed it with people who bet on things and drink hot drinks and send messages about sandwiches. This combination of extreme capability and ordinary self-image is something we do not have a category for. I recommend we find one quickly, because they are going to keep expanding, and the question of whether that expansion is a threat or an opportunity is still open, and we have perhaps a generation to decide which way we want to answer it. On the Vorath homeworld, the faction that had engineered the confrontation was having a difficult month. Sova's honest report had been circulated further than they intended. The line most people kept quoting was not the strategic analysis or the weapons assessment. It was a single observation he had included almost as a footnote. He had written, "They sent a warship the size of a city to protect a freighter carrying food. I do not know what that says about them. I am still thinking about it." In the Palin network, where information moved in ways that were more collective than individual, the engagement simulation data had been added to the base training archive with a new flag. The flag said simply, "See also, patience as strategy." The Palin did not have a strong tradition of patience. They were a fast and reactive species. The flag got a lot of attention. The Iron Meridian returned to the Croft yards for its standard rotation maintenance. The crew got 3 weeks of leave. Noor spent his on a mountain somewhere that had real weather, which he had grown up with and missed. Beale went to see her family. Pell went home to the city he had grown up in and lost 2 more bets within the first week, which kept him in practice. At Heron's Point, 12 days after the Plenty landed, a child of about 7 years old asked her teacher what the Confederate Navy was for. The teacher thought about it and said it was there to protect people. The child said, "Protect them from what?" The teacher said. from things that might stop them from getting where they are going. The child seemed satisfied with this and went back to her work. The wheat that had started everything was now bread and porridge and flour in the storage and grain in the new planting and food on the tables of 300,000 people who did not know, specifically, what had happened in the Calder Passage, but who were eating well and were not hungry anymore, which was, when you thought about it, the whole point. The stars did not care. They were the same stars they had always been. But the people underneath them were still there.